G'day everybody, how are you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope that you are super well. Today we have a first look at the Viltrox 40mm f2.5 for Z mount. Now this appears to be part of Viltrox's entry level range of lenses. And how do you think it's doing this talking head shot? This lens is very small, it's very light, it's native Z, it's full frame, and it has autofocus. It's absolutely astonishing the number of lenses that are coming out for Z mount, let alone the number of lenses that are coming out from Viltrox alone for Z mount. I can't wait to see what we get out of the rest of this year. This is a collection of images from the recent school holidays here in Australia. 2 weeks of walking around with this lens and my kids just using this lens as this sort of lens would be used. It's an everyday lens. And let's not forget the price that it comes with, $158 US. It's autofocus, it's full frame, and it's native Z mount. Starting off here, just looking at rendering in bright sunlight, and I think this lens comes up really well. Straight off the bat at 100%, we can see there is a very small amount of aberrating going on here. There's a little bit of green fringing. Very, very minor. We are at 2.5, so we're wide open, 64 ISO. We also here get a chance to look at what the background looks like. And we do get smoother lenses with this. All lenses are different. They all have their own character. If you love super smooth, you're not necessarily getting it with this lens. And again, we can see very, very minor signs of green fringing here on this pole. Otherwise, I think the depth of field is there, the sharpness is there, and it is performing very well. I do think it doesn't have as much contrast as, well, of course, more expensive lenses. Contrast is one of these things that's easy to fix. We can talk about contrast, we can talk about vignetting. These are things that lenses still have. It still happens with lenses, both of those things, but both of them are very quickly addressable. I'm almost at the point where you kind of don't need to talk about things that can be addressed. And I will only talk about them just so everybody knows to address it. Here, a very clear indication of flare, and we can see a rainbow style flare going on here. An absolute direct circle, that is the sun as it's heading towards setting over the city of Melbourne. And we can see some purple fringing here on the water quite clearly. We are at 2.5. Now this lens, like many other lenses that fit in this category, super affordable lenses, you stop them down from 2.5 maybe to something like f4 and the fringing goes away. Something to think about. A lot of the time I don't think it really matters. In the case of this image, focus was on the yellow caution sign here, the caution buoy or buoy as they say in some parts of the world, and we can actually see that the background is a little bit soft. That is depth of field. There is the smallest sign of purple and green fringing here on the water. We are getting a tiny little bit of flare even within the lens from the water, and you can just see that a tiny bit with the clarity being just brought down slightly in this area. And that's another thing to think about when you have lenses that are this affordable, that flare within the lens, aberrating within the lens. But again, if we look at depth of field, critical focus is here in this area, in this plane here. And that's actually looking the right amount of contrast. And it's only as we kind of fall into the background, which again is actually slightly out of focus. And it's a really interesting illusion that this lens is creating. Because it's 2.5, it's not giving us a lot of out of focus areas when you're shooting a wide vista like this, but it's just a little bit out of focus, which makes the lens seem soft because it didn't achieve focus when actually it's not in focus. This is a photographer's choice issue rather than a lens issue. In other words, I'm used to shooting at 1.8 or perhaps 1.2, where this background would be far more clearly out of focus due to depth of field and have nothing to do with the lens. So that is something that's interesting to me and something that I think is critical to note, that 2.5, when you're shooting this sort of landscape, it might feel like the lens is soft when actually it's just a tiny bit in the out of focus depth of field range. And this image is another example of that, where the foreground is clearly in focus, and then as we go further back, we can see things are falling gently. It's very gently out of focus, because 40mm is actually, reasonably wide, and 2.5 starts to be not a super thin depth of field. So there's an interesting, almost like a paradox. When you get super wide, almost everything is in focus regardless of f-stops. Of course, that's not true if you're focusing really close on the lens, but in this case, I'm focusing on something that's 5 meters, 15 feet from the lens, and with an even wider lens, you wouldn't really be able to tell what the background was doing, whether it's in focus or not. It really is sitting in this sweet spot, which is quite interesting to me. It's an interesting conundrum. 200%, yes, and I didn't see it, so you're not going to see it if you're posting it on Instagram and in most situations, but there is some very clear purple fringing here. So what we will take a look at is we will put on the purple fringing tool, and that's done a fantastic job of removing the majority of that. To reiterate what I said before, things like contrast, vignetting, and purple fringing, all of these are often quite correctable. We can see green fringing here in the background, but again, I do think it's very minor considering we're at 200% and you just don't really clock it. Not looking into the sun, but the sun more behind. And I think this lens renders really nicely. It's quite sharp, but I wouldn't say it is super crazy sharp. Consider the target audience. I think these are lovely results. And someone that buys this sort of lens goes, right, well, now I know I like 40mm or 20mm, and I want to go up to the next level. And that might be getting yourself a beautiful S-class lens. You haven't had to make a big investment to find out if this sort of lens is for you from a kind of artistic and framing perspective. I think that's a nice rendition, again, for a lens at this price point. My lovely daughter taking some photos of me here on the river, and you can see from a portrait perspective it's doing an absolutely fine job. I'm probably about 7 or 8 feet from the camera, 2.5 meters, and beautiful fall off in the background. I think that's looking great. Great work to my daughter. She's got a keen eye. Actually, both my daughters have keen photographic eyes. And just as we were leaving, the sun had set and we had this just beautiful moment that didn't last long at all. And there it is, captured by the Viltrox ISO 64 1/250th f2.8 pixel for pixel. That is just rendering that area in the middle of frame on this almost 46 megapixel Z8. What a great rendition. That is looking sharp. That is looking beautiful. Really, I do think that this illustrates the versatility of this lens. Let's take a little bit of a look at this lens. Now, it wouldn't matter whether we were on a ZFC, a ZF, a Z6, a Z8 or a Z9, same deal. This is a Z mount lens. I do think this is Viltrox's entry-level range of lenses. No buttons, no switches, absolutely nothing there. No aperture. We do have a focus ring. So that's cool. That's fine by me, considering the price that you pay. Now, it does have a metal mount and a USB-C port so that you can upgrade firmware at a later date. I love this capture for the color and the moment and just everything that's going on here. This is perfectly delicious for me. I would probably actually increase the vignetting to bring the intimacy to the center of frame. But yeah, I love the twilight. What a great opportunity. So this is handheld ISO 64. I always try and keep my ISOs as low as I can. I will always take the shutter and the aperture to the absolute limit in order to maintain ISO. That's my approach because I'm not shooting sports. I'm usually shooting things that are static. Now, of course, if I'm shooting something that's moving and I want to freeze it, then yes, ISOs have to move or I have to change lens. Love this rendition, and for 1/5 of a second handheld, critical focus is around here on this box area. I think that's hanging together pretty well. We are at 2.8. Looking at the out of focus as well as the Bokeh Balls, and I think they're really nice. I don't see anything wrong with how soft and lovely that looks. And of course, they're not perfectly round due to the construction of this lens. But again, character, it's interesting. They're all different on every lens, and there's nothing wrong with these ones. but yes, they're not round on the edges, that's for sure. 2.5, 1/10,000th, ISO 64. It's a little bit of a mess of green and purple fringing. This is stressing this lens. We can clearly see it. Something to keep in mind. Now, if we hit the purple fringing, I think that probably did make a difference. Yes, it did. It's very easy to see. Again, this is probably the harshest thing we can throw at any lens. I like the softness. I think it looks great. And color rendition is good. Night work, 640 ISO, 1/20th, f2.5. Doable. I just want to show you what's possible. This is possible. Now, there is something about this lens that I can't quite put my finger on. I do think it's a contrast. I think some people call it micro contrast. I'm not really sure what the difference is between contrast and micro contrast. I've had different people telling me different things. Some people saying doesn't really exist, it's just contrast. Either way, I do think it does lack a tiny bit of contrast. This is the entry-level lens from Viltrox, and I do think they have at least 3 tiers of lenses. I'm happy with the value proposition with this lens, but you just need to keep all of these little minor things in mind. I think that's a better frame, better composition, 1/10 of a second. My beautiful bike, the new wheels with the front pack rack, which I'm hoping to mount a camera on at some point. Still trying to work it out. Got to work out some sort of dampening system for all the crazy bumps. ISO 64, 1/10 of a second, f2.5, 40mm, handheld, 100%. You can see here how I carry my tripod around with some octopus straps, we call them in Australia. Not very glamorous and not very complicated, but that's how I get stuff done. When you're creating something like 2 reviews, whether it's a camera or a lens or another piece of equipment a week, you got to fly around to keep finding new shots. That's what I'm trying to do. New angles, new times of day. There's no better way than flying around on an electric bike. This lens has 10 elements in 6 groups. The viewing angle is 57.8 degrees. The maximum f-stop is f16. There are 7 aperture blades. The minimum focus distance is 34 centimeters. There's an SDM focus motor. The circumference of the lens is 68 millimeters and it's 55.9 millimeters long. It comes in at a mere 180 grams and is toting a 52 millimeter filter thread. There it is, right there, right there, boom. The lens hood is pretty easy to take on and take off, something to be aware of, although it hasn't fallen off and I've been riding around for 2 or 3 hours now. So I think that's fine. It is 100% composite besides the mount ring. So again, that's something to keep in mind, but of course, it's a very light lens. Pixel for pixel, 1/10 of a second, f2.5. The bike is sharp. It is sharp enough for what's required at this price point of lens. That gives you an idea. And I like the really soft fall off in the background. This sort of lens is not going to give you the sort of fall off for people, because we can see here there's not a lot of fall off going on, and this is sort of at person. If you had a person standing, they'd be pretty much filling the frame, give or take. So this is not going to give you the sort of fall off that you might want in some circumstances, and that's 2.5 at 40mm. These are, from photography terms, these are 2 very average places to be. 35 to 50mm, bang, they are just your average lens. f2.8 or f4, they are like your most average apertures. And that's where this lens is sitting. And that's fine, because it's at an extraordinary price from my perspective. And to be able to shoot exactly what you see me shooting here, at this price point, yep, I think it's good. More out of focus areas, more Bokeh Balls. I really like what I'm seeing here. There is absolutely nothing to complain about. From my perspective, this is a really powerful outcome from a lens like this. We are talking late at night, 10 o'clock at night. The sun's been down for 3 or 4 hours. And this is a really compelling and beautiful shot, a level of image that I could use in a calendar. So that's a great result from my perspective. We are handheld at 1/4 of a second, f2.5, ISO 64. I actually wanted the train to be moving, so I'm happy for that slow shutter speed. My elbows are resting on the bridge that I'm on. I would recommend that this lens can be used handheld at something around a 1/5 to a 1/10 of a second if you employ really good technique. That seems to be the limit on this particular lens. An example of flare here, I'm looking up into a street light here on the right hand side, and very clearly we have flare. Now, this has been the first example of this that I think has been this intrusive in the frame, and so I think it shows that flare is handled pretty well most of the time with this lens. I'm just changing the color temperature and making that far more pleasing to me than it was the more yellow version. But I'm okay with that. 1/25 f2.5. Again, I'm just trying to illustrate that if you're a tourist, you're in another country, you're walking around a city and you have this lens, you can get day, you can get night, you can get people. A perfect sort of lens to couple with your Z8 or your ZF or your Z6, your Z5. This to me is just a very layered composition. I was messing around with trying to capture under the road and over the road and the art center spire all in one frame. I'm not sure if I pulled it off, and I'm not sure what I think of the color temperature. I don't like the super yellows that you find in some underpasses. I would probably have to mask the bottom and do that separately, which I won't do now. That's probably a better shot, getting some movement into it by having the car there. That'd be my favorite one. ISO 1/25, 1/6 of a second, 2.5. The bathing boxes, just looking at color rendition and sharpness, and I'm really happy with what I'm seeing there. This file is absolutely untouched. So if we wanted to make it feel a bit sharper, we can hit clarity. We might bring up that, throw a little bit of extra color at it, and there you go. It looks a little bit better. And it's interesting, an entry-level lens like this, you can bring it up a little bit more in post if you so desire. Is it necessary for a lot of snaps? No. And this is just to show sharpness and bokeh and color rendition, all of which I think is fine. And again, we could add a little bit of extra color, a little bit of extra sharpness, and it does actually change this image a little bit. All right, everybody, well, there it is. We recently looked at another lens in this range from Viltrox, which was also a great performing lens. And I think for the price, size, and weight, this is another great option. But more important than what I think, what do you think from what you've seen in this video? I would love you to let me know in the comments below. Could this be a lens in your kit? Let's not forget, of course, it can also go on your APS-C camera, giving you 60mm field of view equivalent at 2.5. All right. Well, if this is your first time here, I would love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. Bye for now.